The real House of the Dragon. The true story of the anarchy. House of the Dragon is filled with murdered heirs, broken oaths, ambitious queens, ruthless kings, family betrayals, and a civil war that tears a kingdom apart. But George R.R. Martin didn't invent all of that, because nearly 900 years ago, England lived its own dance of the dragons. There were no dragons, but there was a king who named his daughter heir. There were powerful men who swore to support her. There was a relative who took the throne instead. And there was a woman who decided if they wouldn't give her the crown, she would take it. Her name was Empress Matilda, and the war that followed became known as the Anarchy. Welcome to History in 60. And this is the real war that helped inspire House of the Dragon. Chapter 1. The Shipwreck That Changed England. Our story begins with a party. On November 25th, 1120, a ship called the White Ship prepared to sail across the English Channel. On board were some of the most privileged young people in medieval Europe, and among them was perhaps the most important passenger of all, William Adelin, the only legitimate son of King Henry I of England. William was the future king, which meant England's succession appeared secure, until the White Ship struck a submerged rock. The ship sank, hundreds reportedly died, and William drowned. King Henry had just lost his son, and England had just lost its future king. According to one chronicler, when Henry was finally told what happened, the king collapsed in grief. But Henry didn't just have a personal tragedy, he had a political catastrophe, because he had another legitimate child, a daughter, Matilda, and medieval England had never been ruled by a woman in her own right. Chapter 2. The Real Rhaenyra. If you're starting to hear echoes of House of the Dragon, you're supposed to. King Henry I isn't literally Viserys Targaryen, and Matilda isn't literally Rhaenyra. George R.R. Martin doesn't copy history character for character, but the similarities are impossible to miss. Like Viserys, Henry faced a succession crisis, and like Viserys, he chose his daughter. But Matilda wasn't an ordinary medieval princess. She had been married to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and had lived at one of the most powerful courts in Europe. That's why history remembers her as Empress Matilda. After her husband's death, she returned to her father's world and eventually married Geoffrey of Anjou. But Henry needed something more important from his nobles, an oath. Beginning in 1127, Henry made leading nobles swear that after his death, they would recognize Matilda as his legitimate successor. Think about that. The most powerful men in England stood before their king and promised to put his daughter on the throne. Henry believed he had solved the succession. House of the Dragon fans already know where this is going. Chapter 3. The Betrayal. King Henry I died in December 1135, and almost immediately the oath meant nothing. Matilda was in Anjou and was not positioned to seize control of England, but her cousin Stephen of Blois was. Stephen raced across the Channel. He moved quickly toward London, and within weeks of Henry's death, Stephen was crowned King of England. The throne promised to Matilda was gone, and many of the nobles who had sworn to support her accepted Stephen instead. Why? Partly politics, partly opportunity, and partly because the idea of being ruled by a woman was deeply controversial in 12th century England. Stephen also had one enormous advantage. He was already wearing the crown. Sound familiar? A king names his daughter heir. The nobles swear loyalty. The king dies. A male relative is crowned instead, and suddenly everyone has to choose a side. Rhaenyra had Aegon, Matilda had Stephen, and England was about to discover what happens when two people believe they are the rightful ruler.
Chapter 4. The Anarchy.
Matilda didn't simply accept defeat. In 1139, she landed in England to press her claim. And she wasn't alone. One of her greatest supporters was her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, one of the most powerful nobles in England. The country began splitting apart. Some supported Stephen, others supported Matilda. Castles became military strongholds, armies moved across the countryside, nobles changed allegiances, and what had begun as a succession dispute became a civil war. History remembers this period as the Anarchy. And this is where the comparison to the Dance of the Dragons becomes more than just a woman fighting a man for a throne. Because the real horror wasn't simply what happened to Matilda or Stephen, it was what happened to everyone else. Royal authority weakened, local lords gained enormous power, castles appeared across the country, sometimes without royal permission. Communities were caught between competing armies. One contemporary account described the suffering so bleakly that it claimed people said, "Christ and his saints were asleep. No dragons were burning cities. Human beings were perfectly capable of destroying them themselves." 5. The king is captured. Then, in 1141, everything changed. Stephen's forces faced Matilda's supporters at the Battle of Lincoln. The fighting was brutal. Stephen reportedly continued fighting even after much of his army had collapsed around him. Eventually, the King of England was captured. Imagine that. Matilda's greatest enemy was now her prisoner. Stephen was taken away in chains, and suddenly the woman who had been denied the throne had essentially won. Matilda moved toward London. She adopted the title Lady of the English. Preparations were made for her coronation. After years of betrayal and war, Matilda was about to become England's first ruling queen. And then, she lost everything. Chapter 6. Matilda's greatest mistake. Taking a throne and keeping a throne are two very different things. Matilda needed London, but relations between Matilda and the city's population deteriorated. Contemporary sources hostile to Matilda portrayed her as arrogant and demanding. How much of that reflects her actual personality, and how much reflects medieval expectations about how a woman was supposed to behave, is still debated. But politically, the result was disastrous. London turned against her. Before she could be crowned, Matilda was forced to flee. And Stephen had something Matilda didn't, a formidable partner. His wife, Matilda of Boulogne. Yes, this story has two Matildas, because apparently a 12th century civil war wasn't confusing enough. Stephen's queen rallied support for her imprisoned husband and helped keep his cause alive. Then Matilda's half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, was captured, and the two sides made an extraordinary exchange. Robert was traded for King Stephen. Stephen was free. The war was back on, and England was right back where it started. Chapter 7. The Escape. But Matilda's most cinematic moment was still coming. In 1142, Stephen's forces surrounded Matilda at Oxford Castle. She was trapped. Escape appeared almost impossible. Then, one winter night, Matilda slipped out. According to the traditional account, she wore white to blend into the snow. She crossed the frozen landscape with only a handful of companions, passed through enemy lines, and escaped. If George R.R. Martin had written that scene, we'd probably complain it was unrealistic. History did it anyway. But despite her escape, something was becoming clear. Neither Matilda nor Stephen could completely defeat the other. And after years of war, England was exhausted. Chapter 8. The Sun. Eventually, Matilda's fight became someone else's, her son, Henry Plantagenet, and Henry changed the equation. He was young, ambitious, capable, and unlike his mother, he didn't carry the same political baggage from the beginning of the conflict. By the early 1150s, Stephen also faced another devastating reality. His own son and intended heir, Eustace, suddenly died. Once again, a dead son changed the succession of England. The same kind of tragedy that had started the entire crisis helped bring it toward an end. In 1153, Stephen and Henry reached an agreement known as the Treaty of Wallingford. Stephen would remain king, but when Stephen died, Henry would inherit the throne. 1 year later, Stephen was dead, and Matilda's son became King Henry II of England.
Chapter 9. She lost the throne and won the war. And that's what makes Matilda's story so fascinating. She never became Queen of England. She never received the coronation her father intended for her. Stephen had taken her crown, and technically remained king until his death. So if you only look at the crown, Matilda lost. But look at what happened next. Her son ruled England for more than 3 decades. Henry II founded the Plantagenet dynasty. His descendants would include some of the most famous kings in English history: Richard the Lionheart, King John, and generations of Plantagenet rulers. Stephen's line didn't inherit England. Matilda's did. She lost the throne, but her bloodline won. Chapter 10. From the Anarchy to the Dance of the Dragons. Centuries later, George R.R. Martin would take inspiration from this extraordinary period of English history. A king chooses his daughter as heir. Powerful men swear loyalty to her. The king died. A male relative takes the crown. The kingdom divides. Families betray one another. And a dispute over succession becomes a civil war. Henry I echoes Viserys. Matilda echoes Rhaenyra. Stephen echoes Aegon II. But Martin didn't simply copy the anarchy. He took pieces of medieval history, rearranged them, combined characters and events, and then added something England thankfully didn't have: dragons. But perhaps the most interesting thing Martin preserved wasn't a character or a battle. It was the question underneath the entire war. What happens when the law says one person should rule, but society isn't willing to accept them? For Matilda, that question helped tear England apart. Nearly 900 years later, we're still watching a version of her story. We just call her Rhaenyra Targaryen. If you came here from the short about the real House of the Dragon, thank you for absolutely blowing that video up. And if you enjoyed the full story of the Anarchy, subscribe to History in 60, because sometimes the craziest stories in fantasy already happened in history.